afternoon. Once again, it is my privilege and pleasure to come and spend these few moments of your time. Everyone is watching the world as it unfolds, not just those beings on one's own planet, but, shall we say, in the entirety of the evolutionary focus within and without, shall we say, then because what is occurring is an experiment which has not, shall we say, happened previously. That is the transitionary phase between, shall we say, an endemically physicalized entities, that is, ones who have forgotten where they come from, and those that are waking up to the powerful nature that they truly are. So, shall we say, as it turns out, as, shall we say, the two universes separate, as we have already spoken about, it is not, shall we say, as much a physical as it is a conscious revolution. That is enough for us to begin a conversation.
Thank you. It's really good to be here again with you today. Now, I'd like to spend the next 2 or 3 sessions possibly talking to you about dimensions, realities, concurrent lives, planets, and life. So I was wondering if you could first start us off by giving us your higher perspective on what Earth really is and why are we all here?
As has been noted by many, the world, the physical world as you see it is, shall we say, the reduction of energy into solid matter in order, shall we say, to experience results. That is, shall we say, as the condensation of higher thought comes into manifestation as mental, that is, ideas and considerations, then it is materialized by, shall we call them, desires. Not just desires for what one wants, but desires for what one avoids. So, shall we say, resistances as much as one's desires. That physicalizes by creating the nature of time. Time then solidifies a framework of dimensions. So often one considers that dimensions as such are somehow spiritual. I want to say, as we have pointed out, spirit is a condition, not a place, not a framework as such, but a state of beingness, importation of one's concerns and one's understandings of consciousness itself. So shall we say then that as dimensions become formalized, that is in structures by the nature of systems, that is when one begins, if you like, when one starts to emerge into a direction, then one inculcates the first and direction number one, that is a movement in a particular frame. One could say that is the evolutionary purpose of all that is. In order for that to be able to be experienced as such, then it has to extend itself by a new direction. That is direction number two, the plane of existence, of which every thing is a location. So, shall we say number two? One is located. You understand, this is the physicalization. One is located in a particular position. When that occurs, one has a certain degree of movement outside of the single direction. One is then has a certain extra freedom. In order, shall we say, to fully experience that freedom, one has to raise oneself, number three. So 3 dimensions are the location, direction, and ability to experience freedom. And that for many centuries was all that was necessary in order to build, shall we say, a encyclopedia of experience. At a certain point, however, it was needed that what one did in the past must be able to be repeated. In repetition, then, one extends all of these previous directions along the time frame. Time then comes into existence as if it is as real as any of the other directions. But you have to understand, none of them are anything more than, shall we say, frames of reference. And so one is physicalized by such directions. Then you come to the next, shall we say, dimension, the 5th as it is, where one stands outside of the experience as observer to it. Now, this obviously is not a physical dimension as such. So trying to measure it with physical devices will not make any sense at all. And that is one of the difficulties that science has had, because it attempts to measure, shall we say, the cosmos with physical devices, and it isn't possible to do that because you require a cosmological analysis, a device that is capable of interpreting such frameworks. So then you arrive at the unenviable position that there must be millions of universes. And one has to have, shall we say, millions of oneself in each one of these millions of universes, and so on it goes. And that is not necessarily so stupid an idea when you take the physicality out of it. Then you can see every thing that has, shall we say, a consciousness is the center of its own universe, and as such is capable of perceiving everything and everyone else as differently as they would see themselves. You understand, everyone has their own perceptions. And that is, shall we call it, an observational platform within what is apparently a four-dimensional space-time continuum. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah.
Then, if one were to take this another step further, beyond the observational, then one would appear in sixth level called the creational. Then one is creating some framework in which another part of self can observe what the consequences of actions really are. Do you understand? This is beginning to get to a point where human consciousness as individual cannot go beyond, because beyond that, at seventh level, there is no separation of individualities. All of the universes, of course, collapse into one interactive framework, which is indescribable in physical terms. I want to say that is quite a big ask to understand.
Yeah. I was wondering if maybe you could elaborate a little bit more about parallel realities.
This is I want to say, of course, every universe is paralleled to every other. And often there is, shall we say, interactions between those that are comparable. In other words, if you are in my reality, then of course I might allow certain bleeding from your reality into mine. So you might affect, or I might allow affection of one reality to the next. Then one might, alongside of that, be influenced, shall we say, by the shift in perceptions from one of your realities to another. In other words, if one was meditating, shall we say, and considering another person's experiential point of view, then and they were in some fashion putting themselves in that perspective, and from that position decide that that reality is somewhat more to their liking, shall we say, by shifting their consciousness into the new framework, their own reality would, shall we say, no longer be focused in consciousness. You understand? So they would then experience a different nature. In other words, a shift in their own framework and perceptions. Do you follow what I mean? So each one of your decisions that you make in life, shall we say, has its own pathway. And it will unfold depending on the level of consciousness and thoughts that that particular aspect of self relies on. But it will not be something one would experience because one is not focused in it. Does that make some sort of sense? So you seem to have one reality in which you are focused upon. One reality that is consistent over time. In other words, seems to be a continual thread. But if you look backwards over your life, you may find yourself at, shall we call them, critical points, where if you look at it, you do not seem to follow the path that the previous part of your life would have suggested. Does that make sense? So if you are in, shall we say, a habitual pathway, you are going down a certain road, it seems as if that is going to have a certain outcome, and suddenly, for some unknown reason, your life changes. As if you had slipped from one train to another. As if you had arrived at a station, quickly nipped off the one train and onto another. And now you are moving in a different direction. Over time, you forget that you have swapped. And it seems as if you were always on the same train, of course, because you were always going to the transitionary station. Does this make some sort of sense?
Yeah, so is it just at critical points in your life, or is it maybe you're influenced by somebody else and your perception gets shifted, and can you easily and fluidly change realities from one to another and then potentially back again?
There is a requirement in the determination, shall we say. One creates reality by the framework perceptions that you hold. If you do not shift those, then you will continue in the direction that is ordained, if you like. If someone provides enough impetus to change, then one would almost certainly not perceive that one has actually changed anything. It would simply be so fluid that the new reality would seem as if normal. Does that make sense? Consciousness then always appears as if it is continuous. Contiguous, I think, is a better word. Does that make some? Do you follow what I'm saying? Because, of course, one can change reality much more fluidly than one suspects. And some people demonstrate this. For example, they have a certain life that has not served them, and suddenly in a matter of perhaps hours, they are a different person altogether. Often this occurs at critical junctions. Shall we say, someone who is not a nice person ends up in a criminal institution, and suddenly they awaken to their predicament, and they do something that is less than normal, which is they take responsibility for it. In taking the responsibility, they are acknowledging that they made a fatal mistake, shall we say. And in doing that, suddenly they unleash a new paradigm for themselves. They start to see the results of many things that led to that mistake, misinterpretation, and begin to take their lives back in hand. Such people often turn out to be much wiser than those that did not make any mistakes and did not own anything. Do you follow what I mean? So if you really want to shift your life, then take responsibility for where it is in the present. Do you understand? If you want to have a different experience, stop, shall we say, rejecting the experience that you have. Denial will not make it occur. Taking up where we were and recovering a little bit, because whatever reality, whatever parallel, if you like, that one focuses one's attention into is where one's consciousness resides. In other words, there are other alternatives moving alongside. And as one shifts, shall we say one is in a meditative state of mind and recognizes an alternative pathway which would provide a more suitable experience, than one might shift one's consciousness, that is, become more aware of the unfolding of that universe in such a fashion, many things will change, but will, shall we say, the past will cover that over, paste over the cracks, as it were, so that it appears as if it is simply part of the overall flow. Does that make sense?
Yeah.
And
Yeah,
does it answer the question?
It does. So in terms of the parallel realities, it seems like it might be more around frequency and changing frequency as well. Is that something that fits?
Mm. Mm. As we have said, shall we say, as one condenses, frequency is to do with condensation. Shall we say, something that is becoming more and more solid in nature, more and more crystallized as such. So in a sense, all universes, all physical parallels are as solid as the next. Simply they are not focused in attention. In other words, one's personal attention is not aligned with the attention that is structuring the alternative. It is not to say that it does not have a life of its own, but it is not one that is consistent with one's own recollections. Do you follow what I mean? So there are many parallel universes. Each time one, shall we say, makes a decision, a choice point, an alternative will continue on if it has enough energy. Often such parallel universes run out of energy or consequence because they are not, do not have a source of focus, a source of energy to keep them moving forward.
Yeah. So if somebody dies a physical death in this life, does that mean all the parallel realities also die?
Not at all.
Okay.
And each one has its own fulfillment as such.
Okay.
So for many people, shall we say, there are alternate realities where death as you know it does not exist. Shall we say, as the aging process, or rather as the maturing process moves forward, shall we say, the being loses its need to physicalize experience. So, shall we say, they begin to get thin. Even in your own universe, even in your own structure, you sometimes see people who are not solid any longer. You follow? They become less and less solid, and they are no longer focused in the reality, and so they somewhat drift away.
Are you talking about what people perceive to be as ghosts or spirits?
And also some of the common threads, shall we say, often you call this Alzheimer's, where someone is not actually there any longer. The physical body is being supported or is being fed, but the consciousness is enjoying, shall we say, a different system. And sometimes these people will report what is going on, and those that are still in the physical reality cannot understand what they are talking about. Do you follow? Not always the case. Not everyone, you cannot make this, shall we say, a solid predicament.
Yeah.
But it is there not just for those people, but in many cases, older people as such have, shall we say, had enough. And so they live in a different dimension to everyone else. They are preparing themselves for a wider community.
Okay. So are parallel realities different to concurrent lives or past lives that have been lived concurrently?
Once again, as I have pointed out, lifetimes are somewhat different from one's emerging operation. I want to put it that way. If one has a life, if one has, shall we say, a focal nature, that is an identity made up of particular concepts, ideas that one has structured in order to experience the nature, then one has a single lifetime as such. However, one's nature is often affiliated, shall we put it that way. One in some way resonates as if one is somehow connected to other lifetimes. This is why so many people have claims on famous lifetimes, as if they are the real one, they are the only one, they are, do you understand? But of course, this operation does not work in that fashion. So if one has one's personal exploration of physicality, then one is, shall we say, adding the experiential knowledge into the whole. One is not then separate from everyone else.
So when an individual resonates with a celebrity or somebody known from the past, is that because they're picking up from the sea of consciousness? Is that because it's
of course
put into the collective?
Of course, and it is something that they, some aspect that they are also exploring at the same time. So the resonances, and some individuals, shall we say, can create quite a current, if you like, in the way in which they express themselves, such, shall we say, like a bell. If you strike it loud enough, hard enough, it will bring resonance from quite a number of other things, because there are, shall we say, underlying other frequencies as well as the main tone. Does this? They are called the harmonics. So some people, shall we say, relate to the harmonics of, shall we say, a lifetime.
Okay.
So sometimes it is not, shall we say, the main thrust. It is not the fame of the person, but often the harmonic tones that underline many of the qualities. That is, there is much more that could be said about that.
So we've talked about this before, and one of the things that have come up is that we have threads of other lives. Is that because we're all one and we're all from the same consciousness?
Of course.
Yeah. So when
Shall we say everyone is connected to everyone else over all of time? And if one can shift perception enough, one would perceive the threads from other entities in different frames of reference. So sometimes people claim that they have lifetimes in alien worlds. Of course, one has to take that in certain with certain qualifications.
Can you explain a little bit more about that, please?
Let us say that sometimes the references are creative in order to explain certain experiences, and others there is indeed other consciousnesses that are not focused in ordinary physicality.
Okay, yeah, that's something that we're going to talk to about soon. But before we do, last time we spoke, you said everything has consequences and the consequences are from a different dimension. Can you elaborate more about what you meant when you're referring to different dimension in this statement?
Shall we say, sometimes there are direct consequences one can perceive. I did this and this occurred. It is cause and effect. And sometimes, shall we say, the cause is not in the ordinary thread. Shall we put it like that? It arises from a shifting nature of perception. So, shall we say, you are thinking in a certain fashion, and everything is as expected. It is normal experience, and then suddenly you perceive something that is not in the ordinary world as you understand it. The consequences of that can ultimately open your eyes, shall we say, to a new dimension, a new field of understanding, where the consequences are not from an ordinary sense. Does that make some sort of sense?
A little.
Shall we say then, if we were to take my dear friend's ability, that is because he is not focusing his attention, shall we say, within the ordinary mental framework.
Yeah.
In other words, shall we say, at the edge of one's ordinary thinking is a doorway. We put it more like a window or opening. If you go and stand close by, you are not slipping over into nothing. You are standing at the window, looking through it, and shall we say, communicating with the other side. You are then simply translating what is non-ordinary consciousness with ordinary. It is a translation of a non-language, a non-linguistic world into one that is communicatable and understandable. You understand, if you were not to do that, but of course it requires that one somehow turns the volume down on the ordinary consciousness, like flicking a switch off. So you are separate from ordinary thinking. If this were not the case, then it would be quite confusing, and a lot of bleeding would occur from one to the other, confusions and all sorts of misunderstandings occur. So for many people, giving up a sense of themselves is too harsh, too high a requirement. You understand, if you are not willing to be nothing, then you will carry with you the ideas of something which will, shall we say, affect what is being transmitted. Always, of course, it is wise to put that understanding in place, that you do not accept everything as if it is a given truth. After all, everyone has moments where they slip off the rails, as it were.
Okay. So we've spoken many times around the shift in consciousness preparing us for the separation of two universes. Now, I was wondering if you're referring about us moving towards the fifth dimension, or is it those that do move towards the fifth dimension are the ones that are in one world, and those that don't?
Shall we say everyone can access to some degree or other the fifth framework of experience? It is the sixth framework of experience. You understand, as what was said some long time ago, there are what you would call the root species, the species, and what we are calling the new species is the sixth version.
Okay.
In a sense, it is saying that the fifth version was quite capable of perceiving itself. That is one of the necessities of stepping outside of one's own self and perceiving the whole of it. If one can accept that, when you arrive at the sixth, you are somehow, shall we say, beyond the observer. You are understanding the whole nature. Do you understand what I mean? So unity and the connection of threads of everyone becomes quite apparent. Does that make some sort of sense? So the new species is beginning, shall we say, to shift that perception into reality as a unit of consciousness. All consciousness available to all beings. And that produces, shall we say, the ability to create a new universe. The old will continue to be limited to the end of its life period, which of course will be shortened because it cannot perceive of, shall we say, consequences.
So the old universe, does the separation then create two new parallel universes, similar to what we were talking about before?
I would suggest it is a good approximation.
Okay. And in terms of time, I know you're going to tell me that time doesn't exist, but are we talking in dozens of years, or are we talking in hundreds of years that the separation?
Shall we say, there comes a moment, you are putting a figure so often
Always.
on 2050 is the turning point.
Okay.
So many countries, so many politicians, so many people are making this date the ultimatum.
Okay.
I want to say it is not far from the truth. It is not far away that the separation of the two will occur. The old world may or may not be highly populated,
Yes.
depending on who is willing to take responsibility and to shift their consciousness
Into sixth dimension thinking.
into, shall we say, into being able to, first of all, arrive in the fifth observational position in a realistic fashion that requires responsibility and begin to create an alternative sixth.
Yeah.
So then one will align with the new species, one will support the new species, and one will recognize that whatever resources one has retained belong to them.
Yeah. And by the new species, just to clarify for anyone that's listening, you're referring to the new children that have come since around 2012 onwards.
Yes, of course.
Yeah.
Of course, and they are recognizable because they do not fit. They do not fit, and they do not are not lacking in speaking their truth, even if they seem not to be heard.
Yeah.
You understand, the old world is committing suicide. The new world, of course, will on the surface seem as if it is, shall we say, badly damaged. But the new creativity will rapidly alter, shift that viewpoint. And new considerations, new thoughts, new technology, and many things will appear as soon as the old is no longer damaging it.
So there's hope for us yet.
Of course, because consciousness overrides the physicality. Consciousness is the source from which the condensation occurs. It is not, there is a reality. There is not a reality as solid as it seems. It is solid only because you are involved with it.
Yeah. Fantastic. I think that's enough for us today. Is there anything else that you'd like to add before we go?
I want to add to take the break as it is in consciousness that we experienced and putting it into context. You understand, from one thing needs to be separate from the second arrangement. Let us see what that brings up. So once again, thank you for your time, your wonderful ability to keep us on track and to bring the whole into alignment and into vision, into view. So thank you, and good afternoon, good evening.
Thank you. Thank you so much.